Pamela. Thought they were going to sit. So they were going to sit out here and walk up. Yeah. I think so.
I like that.
Pardon? Oh, from it.
Our scholars are backstage? I'm asking.
I think they were wanting to sit here and there so they could walk up. Pamela's just got to find it. So then there's about coming down the back.
Hello, hello, hello. Good evening, my wonderful fellows. My name is Pamela Hearn. I am the director of the Society of Fellows, and I am thrilled to see such a big crowd tonight for our scuffling scholars. I also want to say, those of you who have little roses on your name tags are new or new-ish fellows. And I want to say that we welcome you so much, and we're so proud that you have joined our merry band. And if random strangers come up and say, hey, hi, that's why. I also want to welcome our benefactor members. This series is something that we love to include you in, and we're thrilled that so many of you have come tonight. Thank you for being with us. We hope that you will fall in love with us and want to join the fellows too. Lights up, please. Tonight is the last event that we will have our wonderful Anna Gross. Come on. Anna is leaving me, and I'm totally in denial. But she is going to be the communications editor at the Skirball. And we stole her from the Skirball a couple of years ago, and so it's only fair that I give her back. But it is such an incredible opportunity for her, and it's exactly where she needs to be. So Friday's her last day, but I know how much you all have appreciated her, but none of you as much as Emily and I have. We love you, Anna Gross. So now, to formally introduce our scuffling scholars, the very jolly good fellow, Steve Hindle.
Thank you, Pamela. Thank you all for being here. I have to stand very impartially in the middle of the stage here this evening. You'll notice that our scholars are positioned equidistantly from their podia to make sure that this is going to be a fair fight. Thank you all for coming. I'm really delighted to see so many of you here. The Huntington does not do enough programming, enough scholarly programming in art history, and I'm really pleased to have the opportunity tonight to work with the Society of Fellows to give a forum to two really talented art historians, one of them very well known to you, the other less so, who will talk trash about one another over the course of the next 45 minutes or so. Melinda McCurdy is very well known to you. She has been a curator of British art here for many, many years. She's curated several exhibits. She's working very intensively at the moment on an exhibit called 100 Great British Drawings, which I think opens in November. And we're really looking forward to that and the programming that will go along with it. She is small but fierce and very determined. Kate Roach is a scholar who I've got to know particularly well over the last 3 years. She's Professor of Art History at Virginia Commonwealth University. She's an authority on 19th century British exhibition culture. She was a member of the long-term fellowship community here at the Huntington 2 years ago, worked very intensively on that project, and has also served on our peer review committees to select scholars for coming into residence in the program next year. In fact, she's here this week because she's reading lots of fellowship applications for next year. So we're hugely indebted to Kate for giving up her time and participating in what I hope will be an uncivilized, profoundly antagonistic, and deeply offensive mutual exchange of ideas about the relative merits of two third-rate 18th century British painters. Please welcome to the stage, to champion Thomas Gainsborough, Melinda McCurdy. And to champion Sir Joshua Reynolds, Professor Kate Roach. Huddle up. No bumping, no boring, no biting, no gouging. We understand the rules? All right. Give each other hell. Have fun.
Well, I'm going to start out by just giving you a slight bit of introduction to what's going on here. In their own lifetimes, 18th century British artists Thomas Gainsborough and Joshua Reynolds were recognized as the most prominent practitioners of portraiture of their day. Now, there's a tongue twister you can say 3 times fastly. Prominent practitioners of portraiture. Good, some of you did. As fashionable portraitists to society's elite, they inevitably found each other in competition for the same honors, recognition, and clientele. It was a competition that aided rather than hindered their careers, and both Gainsborough and Reynolds seem to have participated in it consciously, cultivated very distinct professional personas, and performing them through their actions, writings, and artworks. Gainsborough was the outsider, butting heads with the establishment and advancing his reputation outside the bounds of the Royal Academy. Reading his letters, one gets the impression that Gainsborough could be something of a pill. Reynolds, on the other hand, projected an erudite and sociable public image as the consummate insider and president of the Academy. Reynolds, it seemed, knew how to play the game. Their differences played out in the contemporary press, where critics noted the, quote, proud rivalry between them. Over the course of the next 200 years, commentary continued to play the two off of each other, and their oeuvres are often compared in modern scholarship. Tonight, you are getting a front-seat view to this famed artistic battle of wills. As we will see, the rivalry between these two artists was rooted not just in their oil and water personalities, or in the struggle for career opportunities. It could be found in their differing views on the theoretical nature of painting itself. So, who will win your hearts and minds? Who will come out on top and finally leave his rival behind? Will it be Gainsborough? Will it be Reynolds? Listen, ladies and gentlemen, to the facts that Kate and I will present to you tonight and decide for yourselves. It's my pleasure to introduce Thomas Gainsborough. Despite his sometimes prickly personality, it's Thomas Gainsborough who I think wins the field among 18th century portrait painters. Let me tell you a little bit about him. Gainsborough was born in the spring of 1727 to a dissenting cloth merchant from the town of Sudbury in Suffolk. As a boy, he tried his hand at painting landscape, which led to an apprenticeship in London at the age of 13, under the French engraver Hubert Gravelot. Gravelot taught figure drawing using lay figures, essentially dressed-up dolls, which is reflected in Gainsborough's early portraiture, such as the Huntington's own Lady with a Spaniel, painted in the late 1740s. From Gravelot, steeped in the Rococo style popular on the continent, Gainsborough also acquired a lightness of touch that would characterize his painting style for the rest of his career. You can see it here in the sinuous lines that he creates in the folds of his sitter's dress and the sparkling, effervescent touches that appear in the satin and lace texture of her costume, especially along the bodice and the sleeves. In 1748, Gainsborough returned to Sudbury, where he painted this picture of the local landscape, along the model of Jacob van Ruysdael. As this painting reveals, landscape was Gainsborough's favorite subject from an early age, and his models were the Dutch and Flemish masters of the 17th century. But while landscape may have been the artist's first love, portraiture paid the bills. Gainsborough moved in 1759 with his young family to the spa town of Bath, where he could attract a more elite client base than that which he found in rural Suffolk. And apologies for my Southern California accent, I just cannot say Bath without thinking I'm doing something wrong. In Bath, Gainsborough had access to the country estates of his patrons, and he took the opportunity to study the art collections housed within them. His delicate Rococo style began to reflect this study, taking on many of the characteristics of the grand manner portraiture he saw in aristocratic collections. He was especially drawn to the work of 17th century Flemish artist Anthony van Dyck. As this portrait of the Byam family shows, his style began to emulate Van Dyck's work, becoming freer, broader, and marked by a greater attention to color and texture. And luckily, he'd worked out some of the kinks he had with regard to human anatomy. Many of the pictures he painted in Bath combined portraiture with landscape, lending them an informality and breezy naturalness that became his signature style. By the late 1760s, Gainsborough was the most fashionable artist in Bath and a well-known name in London, where many of his patrons spent part of the year. Though remote geographically, his popularity among this group of wealthy and often aristocratic people put him in direct competition with established London-based portraitists, including one Joshua Reynolds. Oops, I went the wrong way. In 1768, King George III agreed to sponsor a Royal Academy of Art based in the capital to promote and legitimize a British school of painting. With that institution's annual exhibitions, British artists now had a national forum in which to show their works and to advertise their skills. The walls of the Academy's exhibition were the arena in which British artists competed against each other. Their works were shown side by side, cheek by jowl, and discussed relentlessly by critics in the popular press. It was here that Reynolds and Gainsborough met head-on.
Hello, can everyone hear me? Excellent. I am thrilled to be here this evening with you to defend the honor of Sir Joshua Reynolds. And I'm going to begin, as Melinda did, by showing you an early self-portrait by the artist. This is Reynolds as a young man. He was the son of a Devon schoolmaster, and he was one of 11 children. And the family had been well-to-do in the past, and in fact, he came from a long line of Anglican clergymen. But by the time it got to his generation, there was more learning in the family than there was money. And as one of 11, it was very much up to him to make his own way in the world. And this portrait was painted as an expression of his ambition as a young artist. And you can see here, he's shading the eyes. It's as if he's looking out, and the future is so bright, he has to shade his eyes. So this is him as a younger man. Incredibly important to his career was the opportunity to study art and the great tradition of the continent in Italy, and he was able to do so thanks to this man. This is Augustus Keppel, who was a naval officer, and it turns out that naval officers are terrifically good friends to have in the 18th century, because Reynolds, who could not necessarily have afforded himself a trip to Italy, was given a free ride on Keppel's ship to the Mediterranean, where he was able to study the works of Michelangelo and great classical sculptures. And you can see here that he repaid the favor by painting his friend Keppel in the guise of one of these classical sculptures. So it's a good thing to be friends with naval captains. It's also a good thing to be friends with portrait artists who can create beautiful, flattering images of you, such as this. And it was after this trip to Italy that Reynolds comes back to London and really establishes himself as a leading portrait painter of the day. And I think you can see from these two very beautiful portraits of women that one thing that made Reynolds such an extraordinary artist was his psychological complexity. A factor in which I venture to say Gainsborough is perhaps less successful. What? So here we have on the left a lady, an aristocrat, and as you can see, she's very elegant. Both of these portraits, I should mention, feature very charming lapdogs. And Reynolds was a great painter of dogs. And so the woman on the left is an aristocrat. The woman on the right is decidedly not. She is an actress. This is a woman who, like Reynolds, had made a career from her talents as an artist, not born into privilege. And indeed, Frances Abington, the actress he features here, had begun her career as a prostitute in Covent Garden before parlaying her talents for performance into being one of the great comic actresses of the day. And Reynolds was someone who was equally comfortable with the elite and with the less respectable aspects of London society. And I think it speaks well of him and tells us a lot about his character, that he enjoyed the company of intelligent women very much. He didn't so much mind if they weren't also respectable. That was fine with him. And indeed, in this picture, it's a very extraordinary and unusual portrait. This gesture of the hand to the mouth is not something we usually see. And what you're seeing here is both an actress in a role playing a young country girl who doesn't know better, doesn't know how to sit like a lady, like the woman on the other side of the screen, but also here, I think you can very clearly see that this is an actress and a woman of the world who's looking straight out at the picture. And you can imagine the intense moment in the studio in which she was sitting for Reynolds and looking straight at him. And he appreciated her and other people in London society like her who shared his passion for the arts. So our last slide, this is Reynolds in replete middle age. He is confident, he is perhaps even smug, he's gotten a little fat. And you can see he hasn't hidden any of that in this portrait. And this is, I think, what makes him a difficult antagonist for Gainsborough, because in the old story of the rebel and the academy, Gainsborough is the rebel and Reynolds is the academy. But as we're going to tell you tonight, this was a story for both of them about wanting to be part of the group of great artists in the world. And I will argue that Reynolds had more experiments and more failures than Gainsborough, but I think because of that, greater successes, and all in this shared quest to be great artists, considered alongside the greats of the Italian Renaissance.
Well, okay. So here they are, the two competitors, and now you know a little bit about both of them. It's time to pit them against each other. As it turns out, Gainsborough and Reynolds often painted the same sitter, and in a competition like this, there's nothing like direct comparison. And why not start out big? After all, the two of the sitters these two artists had in common were hardly common themselves. Here are Gainsborough's portrait of King George III and Queen Charlotte. Though he never received an official appointment, Gainsborough was the favorite portrait painter of the royal family. So frequent a visitor to the royal household, he was purportedly known to his royal patrons as the Apollo of the palace. This pair of portraits displays a distinct set of qualities that appealed to Gainsborough's royal patrons, qualities that I think our friend Reynolds just did not possess. One of these is Gainsborough's famously delicate touch. Just look at the portrait of the Queen, the harmonious balance of creams and golds that play across her gown, the way the golden tones are echoed in the landscape behind the figure. Delicacy, in fact, seems to have been a long-standing preference of the royal family. While Gainsborough was making a national reputation for himself from his home base in Bath, the King's official portrait painter was Scottish artist Allan Ramsay, who just so happened to be Reynolds' greatest rival prior to Gainsborough's arrival on the scene. The writer, antiquarian, and inveterate gossip Horace Walpole once compared Ramsay and Reynolds, calling out Reynolds', quote, tempestuous coloring, while describing Ramsay as, quote, all delicacy. When Ramsay retired from his public career, King George was looking for a new official portraitist. The obvious choice was Reynolds, the president of the Academy, founded under the patronage of the king himself. Unfortunately for Reynolds and his tempestuous coloring, the king couldn't stand him. Of course, he couldn't not choose Reynolds. He had to give him the post. But while Reynolds may have gotten the title of painter in ordinary to the king, it was Gainsborough and his delicate touch that George preferred. Gainsborough's work may also have appealed to the cultured but down-to-earth king, known affectionately as Farmer George, for its straightforward approach and ability to capture a sitter's likeness and express something of their personality. Fellow artist Ozias Humphrey described it like this, quote, "He shows the face in more points of view than one, and by that means it strikes everyone who has seen the original with being a resemblance, that while the portrait with a rigid outline exhibits the countenance only in one disposition of mind, his gives it in many." I wonder who presents it only in one disposition of mind. This quality had caught the attention of the royal family in 1777, when Gainsborough exhibited this pair of portraits of the Duke and Duchess of Cumberland. Nuanced with wit, the paintings offer a subtle, but no less perceptive, view of these royal personalities. The Duke appears as a slightly shifty character, glancing at us out of the corners of his eyes as he pointedly, though somewhat nervously, fingers his royal regalia. The king's younger brother was well known for his profligate lifestyle, having been cited in more than one divorce proceeding prior to his marriage. His new wife, Anne Horton, was an aristocratic Irish widow, famed for her amorous eyes, which Gainsborough captures to perfection in the languid gaze of her portrait. The 1780 commission for this pair of royal portraits came about immediately after the monumental failure, oops, did I say that? I meant successful exhibition of a pair depicting the king and queen that Reynolds had painted on behalf of the Academy the year before, as you'll be seeing those portraits momentarily. For this pair, Gainsborough places the king in a breezy open landscape reminiscent of Windsor Park. Instead of formal coronation robes, he is dressed more casually in the Windsor uniform that was his preferred daily costume. If there is any stiffness to the figure, which some people might point out, it is a nod to the king's exalted position rather than any sign of awkwardness on the part of the artist. And I think it's fair to say that Gainsborough's portrait of Queen Charlotte is one of the finest of all official royal portraits. The middle-aged queen had never been considered a great beauty, but Gainsborough paints her with such sympathy that she appears quietly charming and quite lovely. She is shown looking off to her left, as if in conversation with someone unseen, and her mouth is just slightly parted, as if she is about to speak. The subtle bend of her lips suggests her pleasure in the encounter. Gainsborough allows us to understand the queen as if she was someone that we could possibly be acquainted with. Any hint that Charlotte is just an ordinary woman, however, is completely refuted by the sheer magnificence of her costume. A frothy confection of a dress that Gainsborough and his studio assistant, his nephew, Gainsborough DuPont, stayed up late, painting by candlelight one night in order to complete it in time for the Royal Academy exhibition. The success of this commission for Gainsborough was assured when the king and queen replaced the official portraits painted by Ramsay in 1761 with this pair. Gainsborough had won the portrait battle with his ability to depict both appearance and inner character. What's more, George, who did not like his courtiers to be too grand, he may have even liked the artist personally. In fact, Gainsborough once remarked that he, quote, talked body to the king. Whatever his personal relationship with the royals actually was, from this time on, Gainsborough definitely became the royal family's go-to painter.
Well, I have to give it to you, Melinda. I don't think that I can say that these are better than the paintings you've just shown us. I think it's very clear that the strain between the royal couple and Reynolds as an artist is expressed in these much stiffer, less glittering compositions. And it has to be said that Reynolds outmaneuvered Gainsborough for the post of official painter, only to turn around and complain about it, saying it was, quote, a place of not so much profit and of near equal dignity with His Majesty's rat catcher. Indeed. But moving on hastily from these less successful portraits, I offer for your delectation this portrait instead, which shows the couple's son. Apparently, unhappiness between generations is something of a tradition in the British royal. And this was no exception, and perhaps the most famous example of dislike between British royal fathers and sons. George, the heir to the throne, did not get along with his father, and indeed formed something of an alternative court. And like many young men, one way that he found to annoy his father was to express different political leanings, in this case liberal ones. And Reynolds was very well known as a Whig and as a supporter of liberal politics. And so his triumph as a court painter comes not from painting the official court, but instead of painting their son and the alternative court of Whig politicians. And again, all of these interesting, less respectable people, the actresses and the mistresses, and the dukes and duchesses who were part of Whig society. So I'm often asked when showing this portrait to people for the first time, is this a satirical comment? Is Reynolds insinuating that the prince is actually a giant horse's ass? And the answer is, I think, no, although it's a very prominent feature of the painting, I must admit. But what Reynolds is doing here is that the powerful hindquarters of the horse that the prince is controlling are symbolic of his strength and of control over military troops and, by extension, the country. Now, of course, this is a complete fantasy. George was never permitted to join the army. The uniform he wears is a concoction. There's no official British Army uniform that goes with this very elegant ensemble, but it gives the prince a sense of status and a sense of leadership, and indeed shows him as much more elegant and dashing than we know that he actually was in real life. And the propaganda effect of this would have been magnified when the work was shown at the Royal Academy. And this was indeed the venue in which Reynolds and Gainsborough duked it out year after year, point for point. 1 year Gainsborough would show an equestrian portrait of the gentleman, so next year Reynolds had to have two. This really was the forum in which they tested their reputations, borrowing from each other, imitating each other, and always trying to one-up each other. And in this year, in 1784, which was a moment of hot political contest, this very prominent picture of the prince by Reynolds at the Academy was a clear statement of allegiance and asserting also of artistic dominance. And I think you can see it here, just the sheer space on the wall that this monumental portrait occupies stakes a claim for its sitter, but also for the artist. And then the other thing to notice is the two paintings of ships on either side are depicting a British victory at sea. And so there's also a message here about the way that the royal family provides leadership in times of conflict. And for Reynolds, this was an important moment, and occupying the center of this exhibition stage gave him a chance to claim his allegiance, which was important for the Academy as well. And for Reynolds, the Academy was enormously important as a source of status. And remember, again, this is the schoolmaster's son from Devon. And the fact that he was knighted by the king was enormously important for him. And this was his house, and he was always trying to win there.
Well, all right. We're going to move on a little bit here from the Royal Academy, because another way that we might compare Gainsborough and Reynolds is by the way their works of art have held up over time. After all, we can only see them as they are now and not as they originally were on the walls of the Academy. So let's consider this argument from the point of condition. Those of us who have spent any amount of time at the Huntington over the past couple of years know that we have been conducting the first comprehensive conservation treatment of our most famous Gainsborough painting, the Blue Boy, in at least 100 years. The technical analysis we have undertaken and the new imaging techniques we have used have enabled us to understand the artist's unique practice more profoundly than we ever have before. One of the things this study has shown us is the uniquely energetic control of Gainsborough's brushwork. Gainsborough's effervescent brushwork was a quality for which he was recognized in his day. Reynolds, on the other hand, was dubbed by the pre-Raphaelites Sir Schloshua for his broad and sometimes downright clumsy paint application. This slide shows the surface of Blue Boy during conservation treatment. As the image on the right, undertaken in raking light, reveals, Gainsborough built up his surface with quickly applied strokes. Layers of subtly different colors and dots of paint to create texture. The slide on the right shows an area in which tiny cracks have formed over time. In terms of conservation, such craquelure is not unusual for a painting nearly 250 years old. According to our senior paintings conservator, Christina O'Connell, its condition was just what one could have expected. This is a testament to Gainsborough's straightforward painting technique, that at this age, his paint surface is uniform and stable. While his brushwork may be dazzling, his technique is solid. And, well, that's really all I have to say. Gainsborough's work, as Project Blue Boy has shown us, really stands the test of time.
Indeed. I mean, who wants to argue with Blue Boy? I don't. However, I think my response here is yes, but. Yes, Reynolds' technique was not as solid as Gainsborough. And indeed, even within his lifetime, it was known that the condition of his paintings could change in alarming ways. But I argue that this is part of the greatness of Reynolds, and this central flaw to his practice is also his greatest strength. As you see here, this is a canvas that was preserved from his studio. He was a relentless experimenter, trying new combinations, new techniques, new materials, always in search of the most dramatic and effective techniques. But he was admittedly not scientific in his experiments. It was much more haphazard at about the moment of inspiration, and much less developing a sound technique and then repeating it. And so the results can, in fact, be quite tragic, as in this case. No, this portrait subject was not dead at the time that he was painted. You're not seeing a ghost, nor did Reynolds, but this is a prime example of what can happen with a Reynolds canvas. In particular, the condition you see here is one of what we call fugitive pigments, particularly the luscious, bright reds that Reynolds loved. He tended to use more unstable pigments that would be beautiful at first, but then quickly drop out of the painting, leaving this very unsettling, ghostly effect. And this was known, as I mentioned, in his lifetime, that this was happening to Reynolds' paintings. And there's a famous story that a father was wondering if he should have he wanted his daughter painted, and who should do the painting. His name was Oldham Bowes, a wonderful English name. And he asked a friend of his what he should do. And his friend, who was a connoisseur, said, quote, "Even a faded picture by Reynolds will be the finest thing you have." And indeed, this is the result of the commission. This most charming, most wonderful picture of his daughter, Miss Jane Bowles, with her beloved spaniel. It's one of my personal favorite Reynolds paintings. And in this case, the gamble of sitting to Reynolds and paying him for a picture that might not last paid off. And we got this immortal image. And this image had longevity in the way that could not possibly have been foreseen by its original patrons because it came part of a very successful toffee ad campaign. So you see here, very annoyingly to me as a brunette, they've transformed her into a blonde for the purposes of advertising. But these are still circulating. If you're an antiques enthusiast, you might find one. And as you can see, it's been given the new title, Love Me, Love My Dog. And this is a very funny example of the longevity of Reynolds' images, but I do think it gets to a really important issue, which is that this relentless experimenting did create extraordinary effects, and particularly extraordinary compositions, such as this one that would have a lifetime long after they were painted. Even indeed as the painting sometimes is disintegrating, the composition, the idea of the painting is so strong that it has an afterlife, sometimes in unexpected places, such as this one.
Well, we can talk about Blue Boy Kitsch all we want later on, Kate, but let's move on to the real thing. At the Huntington, we are uniquely able to discuss the great rivalry of Gainsborough and Reynolds because the museum owns what are arguably their two most famous paintings, the Blue Boy on the screen here, and Sarah Siddons as the Tragic Muse. And while I don't normally play favorites in my job, tonight I'm definitely breaking that rule. In my opinion, Blue Boy proves Gainsborough is the champion here. Gainsborough exhibited Blue Boy at the Royal Academy in 1770. If you will recall, at this time he was still living in Bath, and while he was certainly the foremost portrait painter there, believe it or not, he was still eclipsed in the metropolis by the fame of Joshua Reynolds. In 1768, Reynolds had been named first president of the newly formed Royal Academy of Arts. Gainsborough sent a few pictures to the Academy's first exhibition in 1769, clearly testing the waters of this new venture. The possibilities for exposure to a new, more urban art market must have occurred to him as a result of this first experience, because the following year he decided that rather than send in a commissioned portrait made for someone else and to their specification, he created a picture specifically for the exhibition on his own initiative and on his own terms. It would be a painting unlike any other, one he poured his heart, soul, and talent into. The Blue Boy is nothing less than Gainsborough's clear and confident statement of his own artistic skill and aesthetic philosophy in opposition to Reynolds and what he represented. As president of the Royal Academy, Reynolds' job was to construct an artistic statement for the nascent National School of Art. He did this each year in an annual discourse, given as a lecture to the students of the Academy. In his lectures, Reynolds promotes the idea that history painting is the branch of art best equipped to express the goals of the nation. With themes drawn from history, literature, and the Bible, history painting can teach the moral and ethical lessons that are the ultimate goal of high art. Pictures such as Benjamin West's Agrippina landing at Brundisium with the ashes of Germanicus, which you see on the screen here, express concepts such as sacrifice for the good of one's nation. Importantly, it does this through the language of classical antiquity, in this case, a visual reference to an ancient Roman frieze sculpture. Such references to the classical past, which anyone with a gentleman's education would have recognized and understood, gave paintings like this added intellectual weight. Unfortunately, British patrons didn't buy history paintings, they bought portraits. Reynolds himself made a career out of them. So, he's sort of saying one thing and doing another. The discourses, I think, are, in fact, his attempt to solve this conflict of interest. In these lectures, he theorizes a way in which the more commercial genre of portraiture could be given the intellectual veneer of history painting. All an artist needs to do is include a few learned references alongside the likeness of the sitter. Thus, we have this portrait of the Duchess of Devonshire, which most of you probably recognize. She's dressed not as a fashionable contemporary woman, but as a figure from a timeless, bygone age, wearing a made-up costume that is meant to call to mind the drapery found in ancient Greek sculpture. Sure. Gainsborough couldn't be bothered with dressing his sitters in such bizarre drapery. He painted them in their own clothes and infused them with all the personality they possessed in real life. And I love this portrait of the Countess Howe. She wears an absolutely gorgeous, of-the-moment pink frock. And the way Gainsborough paints her striding through the landscape gives us the impression that this woman is a real force of nature. The Duchess, with her bland face and one hand resting limply on the balustrade, doesn't have a chance. While Gainsborough's straightforward approach to portraiture may have worked for private commissions, the new national platform created by the Royal Academy Exhibition required a different tactic. Adapting academic theory, a la Reynolds, to his own purpose, Gainsborough decided to beat Reynolds at his own game. In The Blue Boy, Gainsborough follows Reynolds' lessons for raising the intellectual merit of portraiture through references to the art of the past. Instead of drapery evoking classical antiquity, however, Gainsborough places his figure in a costume that calls to mind the work of Charles I's first court painter, Anthony van Dyck, an artist whose attention to texture and virtuosic brushwork he had admired since first moving to Bath. By painting Blue Boy in Van Dyck costume, Gainsborough lends his anonymous sitter all the pomp and circumstance of the Stuart court. Though the painting does replicate an individual's features, probably those of Gainsborough DuPont, his unknown status meant that potential clients could overlook the figure's identity and focus on the artist's mastery of elevated style. As an advertisement of skill and as a statement for potential patrons about the differences between the portraiture of Reynolds and that of Gainsborough, The Blue Boy is as effective as they come. You really understand the difference. I think it's safe to say this painting has really also stood the test of time. It is one of the most recognizable British portraits in the world to this day. It was so famous in the early 20th century that when it was shown at the National Gallery in London, before being shipped across the sea to Henry Huntington's San Marino home, crowds gathered around it to say farewell, and Cole Porter composed the Blue Boy Blues to mourn its loss. And while Reynolds may have found his way onto a toffee tin, in addition to the thousands, and I mean thousands, of ashtrays, shot glasses, needlepoint pillows, lamp bases, and paint-by-number canvases that have decorated innumerable grandmothers' walls, including mine, Blue Boy has also found his way to Hollywood.
Indeed. So, I've had to concede that the royal portraits do not measure up to Gainsborough, and I've had to admit that the condition of Reynolds' paintings provides a challenge. But I think here, in this last comparison, Reynolds does indeed have the winning card, and it is in the form of this extraordinary portrait, your own portrait here at the Huntington, of the famous tragedy actress, Sarah Siddons. Now, this was an example of a portrait of a living person and a celebrity. This was the most famous actress of her day. But it is also a gorgeous example of a celebration of an idea, which is the idea of tragedy and the great tragic tradition. And this portrait can be seen as a collaboration. This is Reynolds, the artist, and Siddons, the actress, coming together to perform the greatness of her role and the importance of tragedy and the theater to the British artistic tradition. Now, I know that today we are more accustomed to thinking of the great couple in the Long Gallery at the Huntington being Blue Boy and Pinky, and this makes sense. But actually, for much of the 19th century, these two works were paired together, so that Blue Boy had a slightly older, very famous girlfriend in the form of Sarah Siddons. And this was in part because both works were in the same collection. So you see here, this is from the late 19th century. Both were owned by the Dukes of Westminster, and this is a view where you can see Sarah Siddons presiding in the place of honor in this parlor over the fireplace. And not pictured here is the Blue Boy, which was also there. facing her across the room. And so for 19th century audiences, when you were asking the question of who was greater, Gainsborough or Reynolds, you would be thinking about these two pictures together. And for Reynolds, this was an attempt to reach the heights that had been reached by Michelangelo and the great Italian Renaissance masters, and have all of that weight of tradition behind him. As you can see here, deliberately, explicitly quoting in a way that was meant to be recognized and savored, but at the same time painting a living celebrity. And for those of you all residents of Los Angeles, you will be familiar with the experience, the electric experience of seeing a famous person alive and in your same space. And for contemporary viewers, for Reynolds' contemporaries, this portrait had that. It had the magic of contemporary celebrity and the gravity and the beauty of history and tradition. So it is up to you, I think, ultimately, to decide which of these you like better. And I am so delighted that today this rivalry continues at the Huntington, and you're able to go to the Long Gallery and decide for yourselves between the blue boy and what shall we call her? And the brown girl seems wrong. Sfumato, the woman of Sfumato, I think perhaps is more poetic. Melinda?
Oops. There we go. Well, I think there's no doubt that Thomas Gainsborough was one of the foremost artists of his age, but let's take it back just a little bit. The nature of his relationship with Joshua Reynolds is often extrapolated from his fraught association with the Royal Academy. Gainsborough may have been a founding member of that institution, but he was never particularly involved or even loyal to it. He certainly used the Academy to further his career, but unlike other members, he didn't teach there, nor did he participate in meetings or attend its dinners or any of its other functions. His complicated relationship with the Academy is perhaps exemplified by this group portrait of the living academicians, probably commissioned by the king in 1772. It depicts the founding members of the Academy gathered to study a live nude model, one of the precepts of academic training. Only 5 members are left out, Angelica Kaufmann and Mary Moser, who as women were not allowed to attend the life classes, but they do appear right there in the portrait. And George and Nathaniel Dance, and Thomas Gainsborough. Along with the Dance brothers, Gainsborough did not exhibit any works in the 1773 exhibition because, as Horace Walpole, again, put it, they had, quote, quarreled with Joshua Reynolds. Gainsborough, in fact, refused to send in any works for the next 5 years. He returned to exhibiting for a while, but nearly withdrew his exhibits yet again when in 1783 he argued with the hanging committee over the placement of his pictures. This drawing, as we've seen before, shows the way paintings were hung in the annual exhibitions. In 1783, Gainsborough refused to allow one of his submissions, a group of smaller bust-length, so head and shoulders, portraits of the royal family, to be hung above the line, where they would have to compete with large-scale paintings like the ones you see here. So this is the line. And to have his smaller pictures hung up there was just something he couldn't handle. He wanted them to be closer to eyesight. So in 1783, he got his way. The pictures were hung where he wanted them to. But a year later, in 1784, he was not allowed to choose where some of his pictures would be hung. In a fit of pique, he withdrew them all. And this is the year, 1784, that is depicted in the drawing you see on the screen. There are no works by Gainsborough shown in it. The situation turned out to be permanent. Gainsborough never again showed at the Royal Academy, preferring to exhibit his work in his own rooms. On August 2nd of 1788, Gainsborough died of cancer. As he lay on his deathbed, he penned one final letter to his rival and greatest competitor. And I'm going to quote from that now. "I am just to write what I fear you will not read, after lying in a dying state for 6 months. The extreme affection which I am informed by a friend, which Sir Joshua has expressed, induces me to beg a last favor, which is to come once under my roof and look at my things. If what I ask now is not disagreeable to your feelings, that I may have the honor to speak to you. I can, from a sincere heart, say that I always admired and sincerely loved Sir Joshua Reynolds. Wow, that was a surprise. It was one of Gainsborough's last wishes that Reynolds come to his studio, and the president of the Academy complied, allowing the two rivals a final reconciliation. In his dying breath, however, Gainsborough was still clinging to his own lifelong artistic philosophy. As he breathed his last, he is supposed to have said, quote, "We are all going to heaven, and Van Dyck is of the company." The diarist Joseph Farrington, however, supposedly recorded the observations of someone who was actually there. What Thomas Gainsborough's last words really were is, "Van Dyck was right."
And we don't know exactly what it was that they talked about on that day. But we do know that after Gainsborough had passed, Reynolds took the opportunity of his next discourse, it's his next address to the students of the Royal Academy, to eulogize his great rival. And it's a fascinating speech in which, among other things, he still can't really let it go. So he mentions that it was very smart of Gainsborough never to try the historical style because he'd never had the aptitude or the training for it. So that's definitely shade. However, he also, without detailing their conversation, said that at the end they had really emphasized their shared commitments to the arts, and he said, quote, "If any little jealousies had subsisted between us, they were forgotten in those moments of sincerity. And he turned to me as one who was engrossed in the same pursuits and who deserved his good opinion by being sensible of his excellence." So in the end, we have a story of mutual appreciation. And Reynolds went on to say, quote, "If ever this nation should produce genius sufficient to acquire the honorable distinction of an English school, the name of Gainsborough will be transmitted to posterity in the history of the art among the very first of that rising name," end quote. And it was only 4 short years later, in 1792, that Reynolds gave his last discourse. He knew that his health was failing, and it would probably be the last speech he gave to the Academy. And at that point, he said that he devoted his last speech to the ancient masters and to the great artists of the past. And he said that he wanted the last words that he uttered in this place, in the Academy, to be Michelangelo. So, like Gainsborough, Reynolds was getting in his last word, literally. And in the text of the discourses, Michelangelo is all caps. So you can't miss it. And I think it's really moving, both that at the end of their lives, these two artists reconciled and came together in their shared appreciation for the arts, and also that despite their differences, the terms of success for both of them were the same, and they both very much sought to be British artists, national representatives who would make it into the great canon of art history and be worthy of the masters they both revered. And each of them had their favorites, but at the end of the day, they wanted to be part of that great company. And they believed that there was room for British artists in the canon. And I think in the end, they acknowledged that there was probably room for them both. So when Reynolds says that Gainsborough will be among the very first names of British artists to go into the history of art, I think he also believes that he's going to be near the top of that list. But both of them are there. And so I think the moral of the story in many ways is that for these artists at the end of their careers, there was not the necessity to choose among them, but rather the shared project of celebrating what their generation of artists had done. So this is very good news because it means you don't have to choose between Gainsborough and Reynolds. But to borrow a phrase from the master, I do want it to be the case this evening that the last words that I utter in this place, for now, no plans to go anywhere, but the last words I want to utter tonight are Sir Joshua Reynolds.
So you'll forgive me for having completely misjudged the tone of this event as I introduced our two protagonists. This turned out to be mutually respectful and ended with a real convergence of opinion, I think. We have a brief time for questions. If there is anybody who would like to ask anything of Melinda or Kate, please shout your question out and we will repeat it so that everybody can be heard. Hi there. Go ahead, Judith.
Since these artists were both rivals, is there evidence that they reacted to each other and changed the way they executed their techniques or subjects in response to each other?
Did everybody hear the question? So the question was about whether there is any evidence that they responded to each other, especially in respect of artistic technique.
I think it's definitely the case that they were playing off of each other. In fact, there's a specific case that I'm thinking of, a portrait that Reynolds painted of Lady Maria Broughton, exhibited at the Royal Academy, I believe in 1768. And 2 years later, Gainsborough exhibited a painting that we have on the walls here at the Huntington of Penelope Viscountess Ligonier, which is based, the pose, her attitude is based exactly on that Reynolds portrait. So they definitely play off of each other. And in fact, people often comment about how the Blue Boy was painted as it's an apocryphal story about how the Blue Boy was painted to refute Reynolds' assertion that cool colors should not be the principal colors or the principal mass in the center of a painting, which does show up in Reynolds' discourses, but not till 8 years after the Blue Boy. So what I wonder is Reynolds trying to figure out what to say in face of the Blue Boy? You know, it's debatable, but yes, they definitely played off each other throughout their careers.
And we'll take a couple more. Sure.
Since we have here a tradition of recognizing athletes or Hall of Fame and others with just as good statistics don't quite make it, would it not be nice if Queen Elizabeth, before she retires, might confer posthumously a knighthood on Gainsborough?
Yes.
Thomas Gainsborough would not have wanted a knighthood.
Yes, please.
Did everybody hear Sherman's observation? His point was before Queen Elizabeth II abdicates, and she will never abdicate, but nonetheless, his serious hope was that she might consider retrospectively conferring a knighthood on Thomas Gainsborough. And we'll take one last question. Hi there, Marge.
In the portrait of the actress, I'm sorry.
Sarah Simmons. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. The position that she is in, I have read that she had, yes, thank you. She had come into the gallery and she agreed to have her portrait taken, and she was very tired and she slumped down into that chair and said, "How do you want me to sit?" And she was told, "Just the way you are, stay there." Is that true?
Is it true?
It is as true as any great story is. And knowing that she was famous for her magnetic ability to pose on the stage, it's more likely that there was an element of performance, and truly this portrait is a collaboration. So I think that there is a kernel of truth there because it was her physical presence that allowed him to be inspired to create this extraordinary image. But there is the legend that this is the pose that she has assumed just rushing into the studio, and she's thrown off her hat, and then this is what emerged. So certainly it's true that this was a great collaboration.
Over coffee, you should ask Kate to talk about the necklace, because I've heard Kate talk about this necklace before. It's absolutely unbelievable. So corner Kate and talk about the necklace. You don't have to choose between the blue boy and the brown girl, nor do you have to choose between Melinda McCurdy or Kate Roach. Please join me in thanking both of them.
Coffee, dessert, champagne await. Thank you.